Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. And may the peace, mercy, and blessings of Allah be upon you. Welcome to this deep dive. We are so glad you are here with us today because the journey we are about to embark on is it's incredibly profound. Today, we are taking a microscopic chronological look at Surah Al-Qiyamah, which translates to the resurrection.
Yeah, the 75th chapter of the Quran.
The 75th chapter. And let me tell you, it is a staggering piece of revelation. Our mission today is to systematically explore the deeply layered meanings of these 40 verses. We aren't just looking at this as a piece of historical text, We're looking at it as a living framework that speaks directly to the human condition, right down to the modern day.
It truly is a remarkable chapter. And to do this properly, to really give you the depth this text deserves, we need to talk about the foundation we are building this discussion upon. We aren't just giving you our personal, off-the-cuff musings today. Our source material is a meticulously compiled research document that is rooted entirely in Orthodox Sunni scholarship. We are talking about a massive synthesis of over 150 foundational texts pulling from some of the greatest minds in Islamic history.
Alongside massive authenticated hadith collections.
Exactly.
And basically, to keep our focus laser sharp today, the researchers who compiled our sources explicitly excluded Shia sources from this particular compendium. This wasn't arbitrary. It was done to ensure we are looking strictly through the lens of mainstream Sunni tradition. It gives us a very specific, unified epistemological baseline to work from, incorporating both tradition-based interpretation and reason-based interpretation. Okay, let's unpack this. Surah Al-Qiyamah was revealed in the early Makkan period. On the surface, if you just read it quickly, it's a theological text about the Day of Judgment.
Right, it seems straightforward at a glance.
But as we dig into the research, you'll see it is actually a masterclass in human psychology. It gets into the mechanics of divine revelation, the ultimate collapse of astrophysics, and even the biological evidence of our own creation.
What's fascinating here is the immediate historical context of this revelation. The surah serves as a direct, almost confrontational response to the materialistic skepticism of the Quraysh, the ruling tribe in Makkah at the time. These were people who arrogantly mocked the very concept of a bodily resurrection and a final divine tribunal. They looked at the temporal world and essentially thought, well, this is it. You live, you die, you turn to dust. Our actions here have no eternal consequences.
Which is, when you think about it, that is the exact same materialistic mindset we see everywhere today.
Absolutely. The exact same. And this surah arrives to utterly shatter that illusion. It breaks down the philosophical defenses of materialism and replaces them with an inescapable reality of accountability.
And it wastes absolutely no time getting straight to the point. Let's look at the opening verses 1 through 6. It starts with an oath. But when you look closely at the Arabic here, it reveals two totally different layers. It's a rhetorical masterpiece. The Arabic text begins with the word la, which means nay or no. So it literally reads, nay, I swear by the day of resurrection, and nay, I swear by the self-reproaching soul. When I first saw that, I had to pause. Why would there be a negative particle, a no, right before a divine oath?
It is a brilliant linguistic structure. The classical consensus here is that this negative particle, this law, does not negate the oath itself. Instead, it functions as a rhetorical hammer. Imagine someone is about to argue with you, and before they even open their mouth to voice their skepticism, you just hold up your hand and say, no, stop.
Just a total shutdown of the argument.
Yes, it is an emphatic, preemptive strike against the unspoken, arrogant assumptions of the Makkan skeptics. It repudiates their false thoughts before the actual argument even begins. It's as if the text is saying, no to your skepticism, no to your materialism, I swear by the day of resurrection. It instantly establishes an adversarial tone against disbelief.
I love that imagery of a preemptive rhetorical strike. It just shuts down noise immediately. But the surah doesn't just swear by the Day of Judgment, which is this massive cosmic event. It immediately parallels that external apocalypse with something deeply intimate and internal. It swears by the nafs al-lawwama, the self-reproaching soul. And to understand the weight of this, we really need to break down how the human psyche, the nafs, is categorized in this tradition.
This is where the psychological depth of the Quran truly shines, and it's incredibly relatable for you as the listener. The Orthodox tradition identifies three evolutionary states of the human psyche. First, you have the nafs al-amara. This is the primitive, carnal state of the soul. It is subjugated entirely by base desires and instincts. It actively commands the individual toward evil and seeks instant gratification without a single ounce of moral restraint. If you want a modern analogy, it's the voice in your head that says, eat the entire cake, skip the gym, yell at that person in traffic, do whatever feels good right now. It's pure, unchecked, animalistic drive.
Right, the nafs al-amara is just pure appetite and ego. Then the second state is what Surah Al-Qiyamah specifically swears by in verse 2, the nafs al-lawwama. This is the awakened conscience. It's the state of severe cognitive dissonance and guilt that you feel following a transgression. It acts as an internal judge. It's the voice that kicks in after you ate the cake or yelled at the driver saying, "Why did you do that? You know better." It bridges the gap between that animalistic instinct and higher morality.
Exactly. And finally, just to complete the picture, the third state is the nas al-mutmainna. This is the spiritually actualized, peaceful soul that has achieved absolute harmony with divine will, completely free from the turbulence of carnal desires and crippling guilt.
So returning to the nas al-lawwama, that self-reproaching soul mentioned in the verse, there's a very nuanced scholarly divergence regarding how far its scope extends, right?
Yes, there is. The general understanding defines it strictly as the conscience that rebukes you for committing a sin. However, leading authorities among the classical scholars, like the great Hassan al-Basri, broaden this operational scope significantly. He posits a profound theological concept. He says a true believer is perpetually in a state of lawama, meaning they don't just reproach themselves when they do something bad.
Wait, doesn't that sound exhausting? How does someone live in a constant state of self-reproach without it turning into spiritual despair or toxic guilt?
It's a great question, and the distinction is crucial. It is not toxic guilt that paralyzes you. It is continuous spiritual optimization. Hassan al-Basri is saying that a true believer feels a deep sense of self-reproach for not doing enough good. Even when they do something righteous, they question their own sincerity. They lament that they didn't achieve a higher spiritual station. Think of it like an elite Olympic athlete. They might win the gold medal, but they still go back and watch the tape to see where their form was slightly off or where they could have shaved off a millisecond. That isn't toxic despair. That's the relentless pursuit of perfection.
Ah, that makes perfect sense. It's the ultimate safeguard against arrogance.
Precisely. And the actionable takeaway for you listening to this right now is vital. Spiritual stagnation occurs the exact moment self-evaluation stops. If you look at your life and think, I'm a good person, I don't need to improve, I've checked all the moral boxes, that is the precise moment your spiritual growth dies. This constant internal audit is a hallmark of the Islamic psychological framework. By swearing by the self-reproaching soul right alongside the Day of Judgment, the Quran establishes that the internal macrocosm of human guilt is the psychological equivalent of the external macrocosm of cosmic justice.
That is heavy. The Day of Judgment is the ultimate external audit, and your conscience is your ultimate internal audit. But the skeptics of Makkah hear all this, and they push back with physical, materialistic skepticism. In verse 3, they essentially ask, does man imagine that we will not be able to bring his bones together again? They're looking at decayed, dusty bones, picking them up, crumbling them in their hands, and mocking the idea of physical resurrection. And the divine response in verse 4 is stunning. It says, yes, indeed, we have the power to remold even his fingertips. The Arabic word used is banan.
Oh, fingertips?
Exactly. And here's where it gets really interesting to me, because the interpretation of this single verse has evolved in such a fascinating way alongside human scientific discovery.
It really has. If we look at the classical commentators, they marveled at this verse as an assertion of divine capability to restore the most delicate, intricate, and fragile parts of the human anatomy. They pointed out that God could easily make all of our fingers uniform in length or fused together like animal hose if he so willed, but he gave us this incredible dexterity. Rebuilding the tiny, fragile bones of the fingertips was seen as the ultimate flex of creative power. That was the classical understanding, which is beautiful and logically sound in its own right. But modern scholars like Zaghlul el-Nagar connect this to empirical data that simply did not exist in the 7th century.
The fingerprints. It wasn't until the 19th century that scientists definitively discovered that every single human being has a totally unique set of fingerprints. Even identical twins have different fingerprints. It's a biological reality entirely unknown during the time this text was revealed. So when the text says, we have the power to remold even his fingertips, it's demonstrating this unbelievable scientific precision. Today, we unlock our phones with our fingertips. It is the ultimate biometric identifier.
And the philosophical and theological weight of that is immense. What this tells us is that the Creator isn't just generating a generic human facsimile at the resurrection. He isn't just making a rough copy or a brand new model of a human being. He is preserving exact, microscopic, biographical identity. Every human being will be resurrected with absolute anatomical continuity. Your unique identity, down to the microscopic ridges and swirls on your fingers, is preserved in the divine databank and will be perfectly reconstructed.
That level of precision is awe-inspiring. But the text knows human nature. It knows that even with all the logical proof in the world, people will still find a way to deny it.
Verses 5 and 6 diagnose the psychological root of this denial. Verse 5 says, "But man desires to persist in his evil ways," or as it's sometimes translated, desires to break out ahead. The classical analysis here is brilliant. They say that humans often deny the hereafter not out of true intellectual doubt, but because they want a philosophical license to operate without moral restraint. This connects so perfectly to modern behavioral psychology. Intellectual skepticism is very often a subconscious defense mechanism. If you dismiss the day of judgment as a fiction, what are you really doing? You are granting the nafs al-amara, that carnal, primitive state we discussed, total sovereignty over your behavior. You are firing the internal judge. The Macan skeptics would ask, when is the day of resurrection, as we see in verse 6? But the scholars expose this question for what it is. It wasn't a genuine, earnest search for truth. It was a derisive mockery intended to justify their continued hedonism. It's the ego saying, I don't want a boss.
So when people today say they have intellectual doubts about faith, the Quranic paradigm suggests we should look a little deeper. Often the root of atheism or agnosticism isn't necessarily a lack of empirical evidence. It's a deep-seated desire for unrestricted autonomy. It's wanted to be the god of your own life. It's fascinating how a text from the 7th century diagnoses 21st century psychological defense mechanisms so flawlessly.
Indeed. And having diagnosed the internal psychological root of disbelief, the surah then shifts dramatically in verses 7 through 15. It moves from the internal psychology of the human being to the external collapse of the physical universe. This is the eschatological horizon. Verses 7 to 9 describe the dismantling of the physical laws we take for granted. When the sight is dazed and the moon is eclipsed, and the sun and the moon are joined together.
The Arabic phrase used for the sight is dazed is barika al-basar. The linguistic analysis notes it signifies eyes that are terror-stricken, humbled, and diminished by horrors so vast that human optical and cognitive capacities simply cannot process them. It's total system overload. Your brain literally cannot compute what your eyes are seeing. And then the text says the sun and the moon are joined together. How does the tradition interpret that? Because that sounds like the end of astrophysics as we know it.
It is the absolute end of predictable physics. Classical scholars interpreted this metaphysically, stating that the celestial bodies will be rolled up and lose their luminosity, stripped of their cosmic functions, or even thrown into the hellfire. But what is incredibly intriguing is how modern cosmological trajectories align with the literal reading of this verse. Astrophysicists tell us that the eventual expansion of our sun into a red giant, as it exhausts its hydrogen core, will cause it to swell to the point where it will literally expand beyond its current boundaries and engulf the lunar orbit. The sun and the moon will literally occupy the same space.
That is terrifying to picture. So whether you look at it through the lens of classical metaphor or the literal lens of modern astrophysics, the ultimate lesson is identical. Total systemic collapse. Think about how much we rely on physics just to feel sane. We rely on gravity holding us down. We rely on the sun rising in the east and setting in the west. When those predictable mechanics break, our minds break. We are left in a state of sheer, unadulterated existential vulnerability.
And in that state of absolute vulnerability, the human instinct for self-preservation kicks into overdrive. Verse 10 tells us that man will ask, "Whither the refuge? Where can I run? Where can I hide?" And verse 11 gives the devastating answer, no, there is no refuge. The classical exegetes assert that there will be absolutely no geographical escape. The text says the only place of rest the mustakor is before the Lord.
That utterly shatters the human delusion of autonomy. In this temporal world, if you have enough wealth, if you have political power, or if you just move to a different country, you can escape justice. You can buy a private island. You can hire the best lawyers. You can exploit loopholes. But in the eschatological reality, spatial boundaries are completely dissolved. Elon Musk trying to build a colony on Mars won't save you. You are trapped in the absolute, inescapable presence of divine justice.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the subsequent verses, 13 through 15, introduce a juridical reality that is truly terrifying. Man shall be told all his former and latter deeds. The terms used are kadama, what he sent forward, his direct actions, and akara, what he left behind. This means you are accountable not just for your immediate actions, but for the legacy, the precedents, and the ripple effects of your deeds that outlive your physical body. If you start a harmful trend, you bear the weight of everyone who follows it long after you are gone.
the ripple effects. That is a sobering thought. You are responsible for the echoes of your actions. But it gets even more intense. Verse 14 says, "Nay, man is a witness against himself," using the word basira. And verse 15 adds, "even though he may offer many excuses." The Arabic term is matirahu. How exactly is man a witness against himself?
This alters the very nature of the divine trial. On the day of judgment, the human limbs, the hands, the legs, the hearing, and the sight will serve as autonomous prosecution witnesses against the individual. The human body is not merely a biological vessel, it is a meticulous recording device.
That completely flips the script on how we think about privacy. We think we're alone in a room. We think if we delete our browser history or use encrypted messaging, the data is gone. But our own skin is keeping a ledger. Every physical interaction you have with your environment is recorded into the cellular and spiritual memory of your limbs. So when the day comes, the verbal excuses and rationalizations you craft with your tongue are rendered entirely null and void. Your own skin, your own hands will speak the truth of what you did. It demands intense mindfulness from us. How are you using your physical faculties today, right now? Because they are recording everything.
It is a profound ethical lesson. You cannot outsmart the ultimate audit because the auditor is your own biology. And right after this terrifying description of the apocalypse and autonomous limbs testifying against us, the Surah does something structurally fascinating. In verses 16 through 19, it completely pivots. It zooms out of the apocalypse and takes us into a deeply private, highly intimate pedagogical moment between Allah and the Prophet Muhammad during the actual transmission of the revelation by the angel Gabriel.
It's like the surah hits the pause button right in the middle of all this cosmic intensity. The Prophet Muhammad was feeling an immense, crushing burden to perfectly preserve the verbatim word of God. As Angel Gabriel was reciting the verses to him, the Prophet would hastily repeat the syllables under his breath, moving his tongue rapidly because he was so anxious he might forget a single word. And Allah intervenes directly and gently commands him, "Do not move your tongue to remember this revelation hastily. It is for us to have it remembered and read."
This intervention is extraordinary because it prefigures modern concepts of educational psychology, specifically cognitive load theory and the interference effect. When you attempt to rehearse and memorize complex data simultaneously while it is still being delivered to you, you disrupt the cognitive assimilation of the core message. Your working memory gets overloaded.
It's a 7th century masterclass in cognitive load theory. Think about being in a fast-paced lecture, and you are trying to type out the professor's notes verbatim. You are typing so fast you hear every single word, but by the end of the hour, you understand absolutely nothing of the actual concepts. Your anxiety over retention was actively blocking your comprehension. The divine instruction commands a shift from anxious repetition to active, receptive listening. Verse 18 says, "And so when we recite it, follow its recitation attentively." The actionable lesson for you, the listener, is so relevant today, especially in our era of constant multitasking, doom scrolling, and distraction.
Exactly. True learning demands tranquil receptivity. You must fully receive and listen before you attempt to output, analyze, or memorize. Anxiety over retention is an obstacle to comprehension. Mastery requires patience. The reception of knowledge must completely precede the attempt to master it. But beyond the educational psychology, this section provides one of the most consequential theological insights in the entire Islamic tradition, specifically in verse 19.
Yes. Verse 19 states, then it will be for us to explain it in Arabic, Thumma en alayna bayanahu. This single verse is the indestructible bedrock for the authority of the Sunnah and the Hadith in Sunni Islam. Exegetes like Maududi explicitly use this verse to dismantle modern Quranist movements. These are movements that try to reject the Hadith corpus entirely and say, we only need the Quran.
The logic provided by the Orthodox scholars is airtight here. If someone claims that the Quran is entirely self-explanatory without any external prophetic guidance, that claim directly contradicts this very verse. In verse 19, the divine explicitly takes the responsibility to subsequently explain the meaning of the verses to the prophet. This explanation is the implicit revelation. It manifests as the prophet's words, actions, and approvals, what we call the Sunnah.
The classic example to explain this simply is Salat, the ritual prayer. The Quran repeatedly commands believers to establish Salat. But if you only read the linguistic text of the Quran, you will find absolutely no practical instructions regarding the physical postures, the timings, or the number of units to pray. It just says pray. How do we know to bow? How do we know to prostrate? How do we know to do it 5 times a day?
We know it because it required the divinely inspired explanation of the prophet to institutionalize the practice. He was the living, breathing instruction manual. Therefore, as the scholars point out, Rejecting the authentic hadith corpus is tantamount to rejecting the divine promise embedded right here in Surah Al-Qiyamah. And because this explanation was divinely guaranteed, the painstaking historical science of hadith verification, the science of ilm al-rijal, scrutinizing the men and women who transmitted the narrations over centuries, was historically necessitated. Scholars dedicated their lives to preserving not just the text, but the divinely guaranteed explanation of the text.
It's all connected, the preservation of the text and the preservation of its explanation. After this pedagogical parenthesis, verses 20 through 25, return us to the eschatological narrative, the events of the hereafter. And it starts by exposing a fundamental cognitive bias that causes humanity to fail the test of life. Verses 20 and 21 say, "No, but you love the immediate and you leave the hereafter."
The Arabic word used for the present life here is ajila, which is derived from a root meaning haste or immediacy. The theological diagnosis of the text is that human beings are inherently susceptible to instant gratification. The temporal world gives immediate, tangible feedback. You work, you get money. You eat, you feel full. You gain status, you feel powerful. But the hereafter, the akhirah, requires abstract faith and delayed gratification.
It's the tragedy of short-termism. It reminds me of the famous marshmallow test with children. You can have one marshmallow now or two if you wait 15 minutes. We are hardwired to want the one marshmallow right now. The moral failure of the disbeliever is ultimately a failure of perspective. They fail to weigh the infinite magnitude of the eternal against the fleeting, temporary nature of the temporal world. We trade eternity for a few decades of immediate feedback.
And the inevitable consequence of prioritizing the ajila, the immediate, manifests physically on the day of judgment. The text draws a stark dichotomy between two groups of people, and it visualizes this through the expressions on their faces. On one side, you have the believers, who will have Nadira faces, radiant, fresh-looking, reflecting absolute joy, relief, and beauty.
And on the other side, the deniers will have Basira faces, gloomy, despondent, darkened faces reflecting terror and spiritual deprivation because they realize that a back-breaking calamity is imminent. But let's focus on those radiant faces for a moment. Verse 22 says, "These radiant faces will be looking at their Lord."
This raises an important question, and it is one of the most intensely debated theological assertions in Islamic history, the concept of the beatific vision, the idea of actually seeing the Creator Ruwatullah. The historic debate centered around whether it is logically possible to actually see God. You had one group of thinkers, the rationalists known as the Mu'tazilites, who essentially said, God doesn't have a physical body, so human eyes can't see him. Vision requires an object to exist within space, direction, and light. It's basic physics.
It sounds like a solid, rational argument on the surface.
Mm-hmm.
But the Orthodox Sunni consensus pushed back hard against this. Their rebuttal from the Ash'ari, Maturidi, and Athari schools was essentially, you're trying to apply earthly physics to a heavenly reality. They insisted that the laws of physics governing earthly optics simply do not apply in the eschatological realm. The Orthodox stance is that believers will literally see the divine in the hereafter with their physical eyes, but bila kaif, which means without asking how, free of any spatial dimensions, physical embodiment, or earthly limitations.
Furthermore, this Orthodox stance is cemented by authentic hadith literature. There is a famous narration where the companions asked the Prophet Muhammad if they would see their Lord on the Day of Judgment. The Prophet responded by asking them, "Do you have any doubts about seeing the full moon on a cloudless night?" When they said no, he told them, "Then you will see your Lord in the same way."
And just to clarify for you listening, as the sources heavily emphasize, the analogy to the moon does not imply that the Creator resembles the moon in any way, shape, or form. The analogy is entirely about the absolute clarity and undeniable certainty of the vision. You won't be squinting, you won't be guessing, you won't be looking through a fog. It will be a clear, undeniable vision.
Precisely. The spiritual lesson derived from this is profound. The ultimate reward in paradise isn't the sensory pleasures. It isn't the rivers of milk and honey, or the beautiful gardens, or the mansions. The ultimate reward is the removal of the veil between the Creator and the created. The reason those faces are nadira, radiant and fresh, is because they are a direct reflection of the absolute, unfiltered beauty they are witnessing. Conversely, the despondent faces reflect the ultimate punishment, eternal spiritual deprivation, and the permanent veil of separation from the divine.
It's an overwhelming concept to try and wrap your mind around, experiencing the presence of the divine without a veil. But before anyone gets to the Day of Judgment, we all have to pass through a much narrower, much more intimate gateway. Verses 26 through 30 zoom way in. We move from the macroscopic events of the cosmos and the beatific vision down to the microscopic, universally inevitable reality of individual death.
Yes. The text brings us to the point of no return. Verse 26 says, "Nay, when a man's soul reaches up to the throat," using the word taraki, which specifically refers to the collarbones. At this precise physiological juncture, the veil of the unseen is lifted for the dying individual. The absolute futility of all their worldly attachments becomes starkly, terrifyingly clear.
The imagery is so visceral, you can picture the panic in the ICU. The machines are beeping, the family is frantic, and the individual themselves is slipping away. Verse 27 says, "And it is said, is there any enchanter who can step forward and help?" The Arabic word is rock. Some classical scholars interpret this as referring to those who recite incantations or prayers for healing. Meanwhile, others view it as a desperate call for any medical doctor capable of reversing the dying process. Someone do something.
It is the ultimate moment of desperation. Wealth cannot buy a cure, influence cannot secure a delay, and no physician can stop the soul from leaving. Verse 28 confirms this realization for the dying person, and he realizes that the hour of parting has come. Death is an irreversible frontier. But then we arrive at verse 29, which introduces a highly notable divergence in how the text is interpreted in the Sunni scholarly data. The verse reads, "And kaf is intertwined with kaf, or one shank is joined with the other, shank wal tefet al sak bayal sak."
Right. And as we look at the source data, there's a fascinating split between a literal physical description and a profound metaphorical interpretation. Let's look at the literalists first. They look at this clinically. Scholars like Hassan al-Basri, they interpret shank joined with shank as the physical reality of rigor mortis, the paralyzing spasms of the death agony where the legs cross, or the literal binding of the dead person's legs together in the burial shroud. The dying person has lost all motor function. They cannot move their legs to support themselves anymore.
That is the grim, physical reality of death. But then you have the metaphorical interpretation, championed by scholars like Ibn Abbas, who is considered the premier exegete among the companions. They abstract the imagery of the two shanks. They interpret this as the collision of two massive hardships. The immense agony of leaving the temporal world, leaving your family, your wealth, everything you built, colliding with the terrifying prospect of entering the eternal world. The two shanks represent the crushing collision of these two realms in the mind of the dying denier.
So what does this all mean? We have a clinical description of a dying spastic body versus a vast metaphysical metaphor about the collision of worlds. The conclusion drawn from our research is that both interpretations, despite being so different in scope, serve the exact same purpose. They are stripping the denier of their earthly arrogance by exposing their absolute, undeniable helplessness at the threshold of eternity. Whether it's your physical legs being literally wrapped in a shroud or your soul being crushed between two realms, the destination is unavoidable. As verse 30 concludes, on that day you will be driven to your Lord.
This brings us to a crucial juxtaposition in the surah. After describing the solemn, inescapable reality of death, the text contrasts it with the absurd arrogance of the denier during his worldly life. Verses 31 through 33 describe an individual, so he neither believed nor established ritual prayer. But on the contrary, he belied and turned away. Then he walked in conceit to his family.
The Arabic verb for walking in conceit is yadamada, which means swaggering, walking with an inflated, obnoxious sense of self-admiration. These verses weren't just about a general type of person. They were specifically revealed concerning the archetype of the swaggerer, Abu Jahl, the arch-nemesis of early Islam in Makkah.
Abu Jahl's response to the prophetic message wasn't just a polite intellectual rejection. It was a physical, boastful arrogance. He had a profound psychological superiority complex. His strutting, his yadamata, was the physical manifestation of his internal belief in his own invulnerability. Historical accounts record that when the Prophet Muhammad personally confronted Abu Jahl and warned him of the hereafter, Abu Jahl physically grabbed his own clothes, puffed out his chest, swaggered, and arrogantly declared that neither Muhammad nor his Lord could harm him. He proclaimed himself the mightiest and most honorable man between the mountains of Makkah.
The pure hubris of the man. But the Quran responds to this swagger with a linguistic hammer. Verses 34 and 35 mock his hubris with a repetitive, rhythmic condemnation. Woe to you! This attitude is worthy of you, altogether worthy. Again, it is worthy of you, altogether worthy. It's a sarcastic sealing of his fate. You think you are mighty. This humiliation is exactly what you deserve.
It is a devastating critique. But the ethical warning here transcends the historical figure of Abu Jahl. The text sets him up as an archetype. Anytime we, as human beings, dismiss divine accountability and replace our humility with narcissistic self-admiration, we are channeling the destructive archetype of Abu Jahl. Arrogance is the physical manifestation of spiritual blindness. When you see someone constantly flexing their wealth, their status, their perceived invincibility, you are looking at someone who has forgotten the reality of the two shanks intertwining.
And to cure this spiritual blindness, to completely dismantle the arrogance, the Sutta closes its final verses, 36 through 40, with a majestic philosophical and biological argument. It addresses the core concept of nihilism in verse 36. Does man think that he will be left neglected? The word is Sutta, left without purpose, left to just wander aimlessly without accountability. If there is no resurrection, human existence is just a purposeless, random anomaly.
To prove that life has a profound design and an ultimate accounting, the text doesn't rely on abstract philosophy. It uses empirical biology. It points to the meticulously engineered stages of fetal development. Verses 37 and 38 say, "Had he not been a sperm from semen emitted, then he was a clinging clot, and Allah created his form and proportioned him."
It outlines the progression from a microscopic drop of fluid, a nitfa, to a clinging, leech-like clot, an alaka, and eventually into a fully proportioned human being divided into male and female pairs. It's an incredible biological summary. But the primary theological function of this biological data isn't just to provide fun scientific facts. It is utilized to construct a logical trap. It builds the ontological argument of the Surah.
Exactly. The surah concludes with the ultimate rhetorical question in verse 40. Is not that creator able to bring the dead back to life? The reasoning is so deeply profound in its simplicity. Let's trace the logic. You transition from an inanimate microscopic drop of fluid into a fully conscious, complex, self-aware human being. You possess unique fingerprints, you possess a moral conscience, that nafs al-lawama we talked about earlier, and you possess a massive intellect capable of understanding the universe. This genesis is an event of staggering magnitude.
It's checkmate. If the divine power is capable of engineering this miraculous genesis out of virtually nothing, then logically the reassembly of pre-existing matter, just putting decayed bones and dust back together, is a far simpler task. The argument leaves the denier completely cornered. To accept the reality of your own miraculous biological birth, while simultaneously denying the possibility of resurrection, is an act of severe intellectual hypocrisy. You look in the mirror, you see the miracle of your own existence, and then you say, God can't do it again. It makes no sense.
It doesn't, and that is the brilliance of the Sutta. It takes you on a journey from the arrogance of the ego through the cosmic collapse of the universe into the intimate terror of the deathbed, and finally leaves you looking at your own biological origins to prove that you are not here by accident.
So as we synthesize everything we've discussed today, from verse 1 to verse 40, we see that Surah Al-Qiyamah acts as a brilliant psychological mirror. It dismantles the human ego with the inescapable reality of death, and it constructs an absolute fortress of certainty in divine accountability. We've learned that we must maintain an active, self-critical conscience, the nafs al-lawama. We must combat our hardwired desire for short-term instant gratification and constantly weigh our daily actions against eternity.
We also learned the vital importance of tranquil receptivity when acquiring knowledge, just as the prophet was taught during the revelation. We affirmed the necessity of the prophetic explanation to understand the divine text. And above all, we learned that reflecting on our biological origins, remembering that we started as a mere drop of fluid, is the ultimate antidote to human arrogance.
It is a truly transformative chapter. It changes how you view the world, how you view your own ego, and how you view the future. Before we wrap up, my co-host has a final thought to leave you with, something to mull over as you go about your day.
We discussed earlier how our own physical limbs, our hands, our skin will serve as autonomous recording devices to testify about our actions. But expand that thought for a moment. What if the very environment around you right now, the room you are sitting in, the ground you walk on, the walls that surround your most private moments, are also absorbing and recording the data of your life, waiting to bear witness on that final day? How does that change the way you move through the physical world today?
That is a chilling and incredibly powerful thought to carry with us. The world is watching, and the world is recording. Jazakallah khair, may Allah reward you with goodness for spending your valuable time listening to us.